So from the last video, you learned that there is this inefficiency, this problem with the flow of Ramada's distribution channels. What we're missing is a two-way communication flow between the hotel and online travel agencies like Booking.com, Expedia, and any reservations that happen from the hotel side, they don't get communicated back to them. So as a result, because of this inefficiency, because they don't get automatically synced, Ramada runs a risk of losing a lot of money in commission expenses. So the objective of this video is to use Excel to track any discrepancies in the guest reservations. And because the distribution channel does not automatically reflect the changes, we need to use Excel to create this process to do it ourselves. We need to manually reconcile it. Now, by reconciling, I mean that we need to make sure the two data sets equal out. And when we do this, we ensure that the commissions charged to the hotel are accurate and that any extra commissions are eliminated. So we first start with this summary tab. It goes into each of our databases, our OTAs and my PMS system, and it adds up the total number of reservations. SumIfs allows for a quick side-by-side comparison so we can quickly track discrepancies. So as you can see, for these departure dates here, changes have been made in the PMS that have not synced back with Expedia. So we're going to need to make some changes and make them equal out. We're going to have to reconcile this data. So this week I want you to have an understanding of how this tool works, but in the future lessons you're actually going to apply your knowledge of SumIfs, and you're going to also learn how to create the pivot tables here from scratch. But we'll save that for later weeks. So the last thing to talk about before we get into the actual work is these tabs here. So you learned from the previous video that we have two databases, right? We have your reservation to London, Canada is first stored in Expedia's database here. This then gets sent to CRS, where we extract the database from our PMS, which is in this tab. If you remember, this guest data has been used before to help distinguish market segments. But again, since we lack a two-way communication, any changes made to this database will not be communicated back to Expedia, which is why there are all of these discrepancies right here. It's because changes have been made on our PMS. But Expedia does not know about these changes. So with this cool Excel tracker tool, we are efficiently pinpointing the changes. And the objective is to tell Expedia that there were actually changes made, because if we don't tell them that, their asses are going to charge us extra money. Now there are three changes that we encounter. One is a no-show, where customers don't show up at the hotel at all. So the example is when you ditched your London trip. Usually the front desk ends up canceling these reservations. So they'll either show up as canceled or a no-show in the PMS. Another change that can happen is an early departure, when a guest decides to leave early. So when Trump got stuck in our elevator, he left earlier than planned. Finally, we have what is called an extended stay, where a guest chooses to continue to stay past their initial departure dates. Now make sure you keep these three possibilities in mind when you start reconciling the reservations. So let's get started. We see that on July 21st, there are 4 reservations listed under Expedia's database, but 6 listed under my PMS. So this is step 1. We always first start at the summary tab and check for when the discrepancies are occurring. And once we know the departure date, we go to these pivot tables here and we select that date. So we select July 21st. Now, we also need to refresh the tab by right-clicking the table, because by refreshing, we ensure the pivot table is properly capturing the data. So if you ever have any issues with the pivot table, 99% of the chance is because you did not refresh it. So step 2 is designating the departure date, which we find out from the summary tab in step 1, and then refreshing the pivot table. Now, quick tip here, to make sure you're on the right track, what you can do is count the number of guests shown in the pivot table and see if it is the same on our summary tab. So we count 4 on Expedia and 6 on the PMS, and when we go to the summary tab, boom, it matches. This now takes us to step 3, when we start looking at the pivot table to search for the discrepancies. And this is quickly done by just matching up the names. And I suggest bolding the names that match up to do this efficiently. So you can just hit Control B to bold. So the reservation we focus on are these unbolded reservations. And I know it's quite a bit, but we'll take it a step at a time. Let's start with these 3 reservations here because we do not see them on Expedia's database. Now, if we refer to our distribution channel flow, it's not that these reservations disappeared from Expedia. Something about the reservation changed. So we need to figure out what changed. So if a reservation is ever quote unquote missing, we go to that database and look for it because something about it changed. So these 3 reservations aren't under Expedia, so let's go into the Expedia's database and find out what actually happened. And we can start with Dennis Lagos. Now the thought process behind doing this is figuring out which of the 3 possibilities is this. Is it a no-show, an extended stay, or is it an early departure? So let's use process of elimination. Dennis Lagos is existent. We can see it on the PMS as shown in this pivot table. So we know for a fact that this is not a case of a no-show because we see pretty clearly that Dennis Lagos did indeed stay at the Ramada. So therefore, the only other 2 possibilities would be either an early departure or an extended stay. So to check for that, we refer to the departure date in this column. Now, side note here, you can see how it's pretty annoying that the column labels don't show up once I scroll down, right? Well, what you can do is freeze panes, and this might be different from Windows, but it basically allows the column labels to stay put, and this makes our lives 10 times easier. Now, I want you to always keep in mind the departure date that we are on. So in this case, we are on July 21st. We're trying to solve this discrepancy, the discrepancy on July 21st. But notice now that the departure date on the Expedia data tab says that it is July 22nd. And this explains why the guest is not showing up on the pivot table, right? Because on the pivot table, the departure date is set to July 21st. Watch this. If I change the date on the pivot table to July 22nd, lo and behold, our beloved guest shows up. And if you look, we also see our 2 other friends here as well, Nelia Lagos and Noli Puno. So what exactly happened here? Well, if you visualize our distribution channel flow, everything just becomes crystal clear. So remember, the reservation first gets stored in the OTA's database, Expedia's database. So on Expedia, this guest initially decided to check out on the 22nd. But since on the PMS, it's now on July 21st, 1 day earlier than July 22nd, it means that the guests, they all checked out early. They probably got stuck in our elevator. Step 4 is where we document this case. We need to note the guest name, the initial departure date, the revised departure date, and the reason. Note that if this is a no-show case, this field here can be left blank. Step 5 The last part is where we tell Excel that our 3 friends left early and they should not be charging our asses for that extra day. So we go to Expedia's database, search for the name, and manually change it to the appropriate date. So we manually change it from the 22nd to the 21st because this is the actual date that these 3 people left. The actual date is on July 21st, which is listed in our PMS. And to check your work, you can reference the pivot table. So I'm going to switch back to July 21st and refresh it. And now you'll see that they magically appear. You'll also notice that our summary tabs have changed. Remember how it was 4 for Expedia? It is now 7. And you just saved me $50. Not bad. Now keep in mind that a common mistake will be to confuse what we did here with an extended stay, because it's the same idea, right? Where the departure dates are being changed. But the trick is to remember our distribution channel flow, because you need to remember that the reservation first gets stored in Expedia's database. Therefore, we know that the guest's initial decision, their initial decision to leave, is given to us through Expedia. Expedia's database will tell us when the guest first decided to check out. They'll tell us the initial departure date before any changes from the PMS have ever been made. And if you get this concept, it's so easy. So you know that the guest initially, before any changes have been made, decided to check out on the 22nd, which you see from Expedia. And when you see on the PMS that it got changed to a day earlier, the 21st, you know that it is an early departure. Now, what if on the PMS it actually said that departure date was on the 23rd, July 23rd? Since this is now a day after Expedia's July 22nd, remember now, July 22nd is the initial departure date. The guest's initial decision was to leave on July 22nd. But if on the PMS it says that it's the 23rd, you know it's an extended stay. You know that the guest decided to stay an additional day. So again, the main point is to always use Expedia's database, Expedia's departure date, as a frame of reference, and this will eliminate any confusion and any mistakes. The last possible change I want to quickly go over is the no-show. So again, step 1 is to check the summary tab for a discrepancy. So we are still off by 1 reservation. Step 2 is to set the departure date. So we are already on July 21st, which is good. Step 3 is to look for the discrepancy and find out the reason. So everything is now bolded except for Emily. So the problem reservation is Emily. So the question we ask here is, how come it's not on the PMS? How come it's not here? Because again, the goal is for everything to equal out. Well, let's find out. So we go into the guest data, the PMS database, and search for the name. And we see that this was a no-show. Keep in mind, again, that sometimes my front desk just end up canceling the reservation. So if you see a canceled here, you can assume it's also just a no-show. Now that we know the case, we can document it here. So input the guest name, the initial departure date, and you can leave this blank because we won't be changing the dates. The last step, step 5, is to tell Expedia to not charge us commission and reconcile it. So now we need to go to Expedia's database, search the name, and this part's important. We need to change the status here to no-show. So in the previous example, we changed the departure dates, but for anything that's no-show or canceled related, we need to change the status. And finally, if you want to check your work, you can refresh the pivot table and see that it is now perfectly balanced. with Emily now gone. And in the summary tab, notice how we have the numbers beautifully equal out. I want to end this video now with 2 must-knows to make sure you don't get lost with this, because I know it will get confusing for some of you. Number 1 is that all manual revisions, so any changes to the departure date, like we did in example 1, or any changes to the status, like we did in the second example, can only be done on the OTA's database. So this is either on Expedia or Booking.com. You never want to change the PMS data. Don't mess with the PMS. You will only make it worse. Because the whole purpose of this goes back to our business problem, right? The business need, our channel distribution flow. The flow is only one way. So we need to manually make these revisions and communicate back to the OTAs that, hey, your ass better not charge me extra commission. Number 2 will help you with your early departures and extended stays. All reservation information first gets stored on the OTAs. So if you want to figure out when the guest first decides to leave, the initial decision, it's on either Expedia or Booking.com's database. And that basically concludes this week's lesson. If you again have any questions or concerns, feel free to ping me. Thank you.